We'll now turn our attention to the next inductee. Leroy Lintereur spent his 30-year career as a game manager with Wisconsin DNR. In his professional and personal life, he tried to protect the resources, the wildlife, and the wetlands of northeastern Wisconsin. But his impact really spread much further. We'll learn from some of our speakers about the legal ruling relative to the definition of a wild wetland is, and how that helped to conserve many, many wetlands throughout the state and still does. I'm again reminded that though I knew neither of these people very well, and clearly not Leroy because he passed away in 1990, that I too spent a lot of time in my early years as an ecologist and an environmental educator working on ecological survey of Cutler Reservoir owned by Utah Power and Light for my master's degree. And then later in the field of conservation and environmental education, took it upon I'm stumbling a little bit, but I wanted to highlight that the quote that Noel selected, I think for his memorial service, the one from Rachel Carson, about the beauty of the rhythms of life and birds, that quote impressed me so much when I was in graduate school. And it took 20 years, but that led to a book that the colleagues and I wrote called Teaching Kids to Love the Earth, sharing a sense of wonder. So I realized that I have lots in common with two of our inductees today. With that, let's move to, Leroy was also a gifted naturalist, shared his passion for nature and wild places through his teaching and writings. We have 4 speakers who will comment on his accomplishments. Steve Miller, the former State Wildlife Director and Lands Division Administrator, worked with Leroy. And then following him, we'll have Adrian Whitevan, who is currently the Timber Wolf Alliance Coordinator and a former wildlife biologist with the DNR. And then following those two, we have 2 daughters, Judith and Julie, who will provide another maybe family spin on the great accomplishments of Leroy Lintereur. With that, let's begin with Steve Miller's.
Well, thank you, Joe, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a treat for me to be here today to be part of this induction ceremony for these 2 great men. I knew Noel pretty well in my work and worked closely with him on a lot of issues, and it was great to have him be inducted. And I'm really humbled, yet proud, I guess, to be able to make some comments about my good friend Leroy Lintereur. My comments, I think, are going to reflect somewhat of my personal relationship and how he affected me. And I think it hopefully will provide some insight into, for all of you, of how he affected other wildlife biologists and natural resource managers of, well, my generation and even some of the younger generation that's out there. So, to share some comments with you, as I look back on my career in natural resources, Leroy remains my most important mentor. Not that he was the only one. There's quite a number of people right in this room, Noel including one of them, that I would consider my mentors too, but I would put Leroy as number 1. His coaching, and more importantly, his views of land and water conservation instilled in me the deep, holistic natural resources management philosophy and approach that I continue to use or try to apply throughout my career. And in addition, Leroy's influence on a generation of wildlife ecologists and other natural resource professionals within the Wisconsin DNR, the County Forest System in Wisconsin, the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service staff, and many county conservation departments and local conservation organizations is very significant. And for example, within the Wisconsin DNR, this influence that many of us gained from Leroy motivated many of us to laid a foundation for the department to adopt during the late 1980s through the late 1990s, a broad, holistic, landscape-scale approach to land and water conservation that emphasized the protection of biodiversity while accommodating the demands of recreational users, most often interested in single-species management, such as deer, as well as integrated management working with forests and agricultural lands. Well, I first met Leroy in August of 1974 when I accepted a assistant area wildlife position in Shawano. And 1974 was some years after he was involved in that very important wetlands case called the Just case up in Marinette County that was, I believe, successfully completed around 1967. And it's interesting, at that time I was hoping to be stationed in La Crosse. I wanted to work on the Big River like a lot of biologists did, but instead I was assigned to Shawano. Leroy was the area wildlife manager at Marinette, and at that time that Marinette area included Shawano and Oconto counties, Marinette County, Florence County, and Menominee County, the Indian reservation. But looking back now, I consider it very, very good fortune that I started in Shawano versus La Crosse. Otherwise, I'm sure I never would have had the opportunity to work for and study under Leroy. Well, I spent roughly 5 years at Shawano, and it was extremely rewarding. I can't recall the number of mornings or afternoons or days that Leroy and I were able to engage in discussions about our work locally and that of the department statewide. While doing field work along the Green Bay West Shore, which was one of the projects he loved and was instrumental in getting established in the 1960s, or visiting sites in the Marinette County Forest, the Brazos Swamp, or especially visiting with Leroy his beloved CARNEY Bog in Michigan, we often discussed the nature of wildlife management work, the directions or non-directions we saw the department heading, and related all of this to the greater societal value that wildlife management may or may not have to people. We were both concerned about how relevant wildlife management was, is, and will be to society in the future. Counseling with Leroy about wildlife issues continued during my tenure as Wildlife Management Bureau Director, and I often used his thoughts to help sort through issues with my staff. And that was a two-way street. There's other individuals in here. Well, if I start naming names, you know, there's Cliff, there's Ed Frank, there's Jim Raber, there's Chuck Pills, there's Keith McCaffrey, there's many others who also knew Leroy. And sometimes if I missed a thought, they would bring it up and say, Steve, well, what do you think Leroy would think about this situation? So he certainly influenced us in a lot of ways. His numerous articles that he wrote for the local newspaper and other publications, his talks, his field trips, opened the natural history of forests, fields, and waters to hundreds of local residents, as well as his professional associates. It was his persistence at teaching, explaining, and reteaching again that endeared him to the residents of Marinette County and northeastern Wisconsin. His example of professional persistence and professional excellence and continued lifelong self-education and study makes Leroy such a grand model for the aspiring wildlife ecologist and natural resource professional. Leroy really breathed life into the land ethic. A lot of us we came through school in the college in the 60s and 70s. Obviously, studying out of Leopold was very important. The concept of the land ethic was talked about a lot. I did my undergraduate work at Utah State University, and the time that I went out there in the late 60s, they were heavily involved in an ecosystem biome project on studying the great western deserts. Then when I went to graduate school at Oklahoma State, we were involved with a project trying to model a local reservoir, do ecosystem modeling of a reservoir and looking at all the interrelationships in the landscape scale aspects, things that Leopold alluded to, and then that scientists were trying to put some sort of structure around it. So when I met Leroy, I spent time with him, for me, it just came to life. He instilled the importance of understanding and preserving the complexity and diversity of life on Earth. He brought to life the natural history of the North Woods and the Green Bay West Shore. For the Wisconsin Wildlife Management Program and that of the Upper Great Lakes region, Leroy's enduring contribution will always be that of a role model, a teacher, and a mentor for a broad, integrated, scientifically based natural resources management approach. Many of us who had the opportunity to work closely with Leroy, and even more who learned from Leroy at training conferences and on field trips, were able in our careers to carry forward his influence and use it in shaping natural resource management policy in Wisconsin and beyond. And I can tell you that in the few years that I had the opportunity to work for George Meyer as division administrator, we were able to make some really great gains in trying to apply these broad integrated philosophies. And we had wonderful programs such as stewardship to actually help get things actually done on the ground. Well, one thought that I had that I'll share with you is that, you know, it seems too bad that Leroy did not aspire to higher administrative positions within the department or state government or even the federal government. His outlook on land management was well ahead of its time, and he could have made valuable contributions to land management policy. However, and this is also more of a personal thought for me, it's also possible that outside of his native environment of Northeast Wisconsin, the burden of government administration and biopolitics would have caused him to wither, and believe me, many have to get exposed to it. So instead, I feel he can view with pride a long list of proteges, and again, many are in this room, that have sifted and moved into many different positions in natural resources management, both in the state and nationally. These persons carry with them the greater appreciation of the natural world as only Leroy can inspire, and they have extended Leroy's influence far and wide. Leroy's contribution is clearly one of the students building upon the teachings of the teacher. Thus, as a teacher and inspirator of others, Leroy has made his indelible mark on Wisconsin's wildlife management and natural resources. Well, now let me share kind of a little lighter note. Some of you knew Leroy. He had a French-Canadian background, and when he wanted to use that French-Canadian accent to make a point, he knew how to embellish it. I'll tell you, it was really something. And I also learned, I wish I would have wrote all these little, Julie and Judith, maybe you know all these, and his sons. Maybe he wrote down some of these old French-Canadian proverbs he talked about from his grandmother and his grandfather. Anyway, Leroy was a bird watcher and a butterfly collector before it was really in vogue to be a bird watcher and a butterfly collector. And I hope I'm not stealing somebody else's thunder here, but he tells a story of growing up in Two Rivers there. Did I say that right? Trivers? Trivers. That really wasn't the manly thing to go out there with a net and collect butterflies. And so he would say, whenever he went out, he would have to hide the net and tell his friends he was trapping muskrats or doing something else. So, and that persisted with him. He had stories to tell about that after he got hired into the DNR back in the, the 50s, everything, that he had to sort of be stay in the background as a bird watcher and a butterfly collector. Well, here's an interesting note, though, about how things may have changed. And I was looking through I have a Leroy file at home. I was looking through it the last couple of days. Here's a note written from Leroy Lintereur to his good friend and supervisor, his good friend Roger Amundsen, who's with us today. It's dated December 3, 1993. Well, back in the early 90s, if you remember, the Carnegie blue butterfly was listed as an endangered species in the state, and all hell broke loose. What are we going to do now? Is this going to be our spotted owl of Wisconsin? So that was going on. And we were working through trying to come up with management plans. Well, somebody had written Leroy some stuff about butterfly management and everything, and I won't go into that here, but here's his view about how maybe things have changed. He says, on another note, As an individual who for 30 years was a lepidopterist, it's wondrous to see so much interest in an obscure butterfly species. You would think they were shark tails or deer or bear or something. And Jim Raber, now Jim's here, Jim was our district wildlife supervisor out of Green Bay at the time. He says Jim Raber may be around long enough to issue the wildlife manager's butterfly nest. And then he says, I hope to be here as an advisor, but he adds, but this, alas, may not be the case, because Leroy was ill at that time. And then he quotes with this, which is just classic. In any event, fellows, I could just hear him saying this with this French-Canadian accent. In any event, fellows, bear the net with pride. We are in the dawn of a new era. So, you really got to appreciate that. Bear the net with pride. We are in the dawn of a new era. So, again, I love this man, and I love the influence that he's had on conservation in Wisconsin. Thank you.
Thank you for having me as well. I appreciate the comments from Steve, and I'll try to follow up with some additional comments. It gives me great pleasure, and I'm very humbled to be standing here at this, to be here to honor Leroy with Steve Miller and Leroy's daughters, Julie and Judy. Leroy was indeed a great Wisconsin conservationist and highly deserving of this honor. It was such a pleasure and a joy to have gotten to know and become friends with Leroy. As many wildlife managers of my day, Leroy was a major mentor and influence on my career and my personal life. I joined the Wisconsin DNR in August 1982, 5 months before Leroy Lintereur retired from the department in January of 1983. And despite not getting to know him as a DNR employee, we did become good friends afterwards. In 1984, I moved to the Shawano office, the same station that Steve had and was a DNR wildlife manager for Shawano, Oconto, and Menominee counties within the Marinette area. And my supervisor was Roger Amundsen, who followed Leroy as the area wildlife manager in the Marinette area. Several times each year, Roger and I would get together with Leroy and go out in the field. These field trips with Leroy and Roger were always a great delight. Leroy was always a wealth of information on organisms from grasses to sedges, mosses to lichens, spiders to insects, and so many others. It was always hard to cover any amount of ground with Leroy because he always discovered so many interesting things along the way. His enthusiasm for nature was infectious. Leroy was concerned and interested in biodiversity way before it became a major conservation issue. Following kind of along some of Steve's comments, in late 1980s, he was especially excited when cardinal blue butterflies and northern blue butterflies were getting a lot of attention for federal and state listing. In a letter to me, he admitted coming out of the closet with his butterfly net, which he had kept hidden mostly because he had been ridiculed by Conservation Department employees during his earlier years. Leroy started in UW-Madison in fall of 1949, a year after he had started at St. Norbert. He started just a few months after Aldo Leopold had died, who had died that spring. But Leroy certainly carried on the Leopold tradition. Leroy deeply cared and was concerned for the land, and he conveyed those concerns to others. During my 6 years in Shawano from 1984 to 1990, I was able to get together with Leroy on a regular basis. I was always impressed by his wealth of knowledge on biology and ecology, as well as his broad range of subjects. He was a lifelong student who was constantly learning, challenging others to do the same. I was always learning so much from him and was always encouraged to learn more myself. He inspired you to want to learn and appreciate the natural world. After moving to Park Falls in 1990, my contacts with Leroy became less frequent, but we kept in touch. He was very interested in recovery and expansion of the gray wolf population into Wisconsin. We often spoke of their potential to recolonize the state and the potential wolves again to play important roles in forest ecosystems. Leroy would have been delighted with how well wolves have done at reclaiming important roles in the forests of Wisconsin. Leroy accomplished much in the field of wildlife conservation. He provided expert witness and testimony to scientifically, biologically sound system for the designation and protection of wetlands. He helped buy and secure many valuable wetlands as public lands in northeast Wisconsin, and he supported research with the collection of numerous specimens of organisms that helped scientists learn about these organisms and promote their conservation. But most important to me and many others, he promoted an intense interest in the natural world to so many people and encouraged the sound stewardship of that natural environment. Anyone who had the joy of going into the field with Leroy Lintereur will always reflect warmly on those opportunities and how they continue to impact their lives. I'd like to share with you a few of the writings, and actually the ninth speaker up here is Sumner Madison, who's probably influenced 2 or 3 of us here. And Sumner's been doing a thorough examination of Leroy's journals, and he sent me some passages from some of Leroy's journals that we thought would be appropriate to read. As most of you know, right now prairie chickens only exist in Wisconsin, south of us here in the Buena Vista Marsh, and to the west in Meade Wildlife Area and a few places in between. But back in the 1960s, we still had some prairie chickens in northeast Wisconsin, and Leroy talks about the last of those. April 13, 1963. This may well have been the last time prairie chickens were observed in this part of Wisconsin, so we'll go into some detail on the event. Walter Krause, Harold Lindbergh, and I arrived on the grounds about 5:30 a.m. We heard birds but could not see them until 2 flushed in a westerly direction. After a bit, we could hear them, and after stalking through some brush fields, had no trouble spotting one of them on a flattened ridge in full display. The other bird, also a male, displayed only sporadically, and both finally flushed when I walked up to the booming ground. No female was evident. These probably are the same 2 birds we had observed twice previously this season. Only a miracle can prevent this population from becoming extirpated this year. And we can be quite certain they will not be on the grounds next spring. As a rough rule of thumb, it should be stated this population has been halving inversely each season for the past 3 years. Year before last, 10, last year 5, and this year 2. One will have to look for factors other than adaptive to account for their disappearance. The openings are still there, brushed in perhaps, but still chicken habitat. It almost seems that once they hit 15, there is no holding them back. They were doomed. No one will miss them except I. Most of the old-timers expressed surprise that there were any left at all. They thought them lost a long time ago. In fall of 1964, Leroy writes about hunting near Wabi in Oconto County. Although Leroy enjoyed many forms of wildlife observation, wildlife watching, he was also a hunter, as illustrated by the following. October 16, 1964. 2 Wabi this afternoon hunting woodcock, of which I shot 3, having flushed 6 and fired at 4. Struck by the golden, really golden of the tamaracks. Just as their flush of green is so welcome in the spring, so now their startling yellow, vivid against the muted browns and greens of our swamps, almost an unearthly color when contrasted to these others that makes up our swamp now. This color is really out of step. There you have it. Tamarack is a nonconformist. Standing watching Tex cast for woodcock, noted a tiny slip of brown shadow against a rotting log. A little Sorex scenario, so mass true, fleeting from one dark world to another. For this instance, in the dangerous light of day, just as man seeks the light, so Sorex the dark. The following is from an article he wrote, "We're All Epigeans," demonstrating his profound understanding of the natural world. Nature is not something out there remote in the Rockies or deep in the Amazon rainforest. She is rather our continuous and ever-present ambient, vital present, or fading or in every flourishing or splintered woodlot, in every green or ruined marsh or stream, lake and river. There is no hierarchy of value here, nor is one segment of ultimately more value than the other. Not when you consider life as a continuum circling the globe. They and we are one. She is one within us, stamped in our brains and on our hands, swirling about wherever we may be. Here is the system that brought us into being, and has always in the past and present sustained us. Our future is her future. Think of it. If we could grasp this most element of facts, what it would mean to assure a quality of life for ourselves and generations to come. Leroy maintained personal journals from the time he was in his teens until the day before he died. And his last entry on October 8th, 1995, were, "Weather today promises to be fair and will remain so for most of the week. Leaves are coming down, how the season does fade away." Leroy died the next day from a heart attack on October 9th, but his writings keep returning us to our home, to the importance of the natural world. Thank you.
Ooh, Adrian, that really got to me. That was really good. Thank you. My sister, Julie Lintereur Misty, myself, Judith Lintereur Johnson, are going to present a PowerPoint. But we'd like to, first of all, just very, very briefly introduce our families. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to introduce my family first, if I can remember their names right now. I'm going to start with, first of all, our brother Phil Lintereur from Florida, Mims, Florida. And then next of all, my daughter Marie Kubicek and her son Ben. Next, Katie Visty Whitman and her spouse Andrew Whitman. My son Fred Visty. And then Dave Visty and Tim Kuntz. I'm sorry, Tim.
We'd also like to thank our mom and dad, Joyce and Leroy. I'd like to thank my husband, Wendell, Joe, and his two exceedingly well-behaved daughters for 98% of the time, right on. And my brother Phil, our two brothers, Dan and Greg, who could not be here today, but would just be absolutely thrilled by this event. So I'm going to begin. Okay, greetings, or more appropriately, bonjour. Everyone assembled here for this memorable event. And thank you to the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame Committee who have made this selection. Also, many thanks to those who submitted testimonials to be gathered for application to this honor. Our family wishes to express and extend a thank you to Dave Jetson. He's now a retired wildlife biologist. He's written a book called Gamekeepers that's really interesting. And he also initiated and prepared the nomination for this honor. And thank you so much to Steve Miller and Adrian Whiteman for your really moving tribute to Leroy. Leroy was and is a voice for biodiversity, conservation, and the Wisconsin idea. In paraphrasing the population ecologist Paul Ehrlich, to ignore these concepts is to saw off the limb on which you are perched. Julie and I will take a brief look at some of our father's 74 years, set a backdrop for his life, and in some parts take a nostalgic moment with photographs and his writings.
All right, we began with our dad's family around 1946. They lived in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, just a stone's throw from the West Twin River. Learning to read was a catalyst for seeking books on the lives of scientists, especially Pasteur and Bob, and for exploring more information on the things he observed day to day. He read Thoreau and learned about Linnaeus and Leroy, along with taxonomy. He found this information in libraries in Green Bay and Two Rivers, and libraries became part of his weekly ritual that lasted a lifetime. He was introduced to hunting by his father.
This is my dad, our dad, Leroy, with the Springer Spaniel Sailor. Okay, this photograph brings to mind an article he wrote for Intelligent Tinkering, a newsletter for Wisconsin's wildlife professionals from April 1989. He begins with people looking more closely at the environmental crisis, stating, "It is a fact of life, finally arrived and here to stay." He points to that crisis as deepening and how, as wildlife professionals, they are a part of a radically changing society. That society will demand much more of this profession than just targets in the upcoming decades. He states concern with traditional emphasis on species that can be hunted or that have a direct relationship to society, and urges a closer look at the necessary partnership in the systems that support us and wildlife beyond the targets. It ends with, my entry into conservation came in the late 30s. An officer from our gun club came up to me in the factory and said quietly, "I'm putting you on the pheasant committee." Wow, that meant I'd be in on planting birds. On opening day, there we'd be, my father, our Springer Spaniel Sailor, and me with my new L.C. Smith Choice of Champions. Then would come the magic day with sailors, swirling wildly, and my dad shout, "Look out!" None of us, surely not I, would hope that scene would disappear. But other values critical to society and our profession are moving to the fore, while some we thought vital fade away. I hope that recognition and response to these changes comes from our profession, and that no one can say that we, of all people, were looking the other way.
All right, this is Dad and Mom. They were married in Two Rivers in St. Luke's Church in early September 1949. Dad is a student in Madison, and they moved to Badger Village, an old site for ordnance during World War II, and now having become a community of neighbors who commuted back and forth to Madison. It is from his university time that he enjoys met and maintained friendships with many friends throughout their lifetime. Families got together and did little plays, gathered their children, and yes, they sang varsity, and if you want to be a Badger. At the end of our second year, oh gosh, okay, when prompted to ask about our dad getting older, what were we to do? To which we would both pipe up, "Take care of dear old Dad." Dad's career with the Department of Natural Resources began in Burlington. He took this honor seriously with his background in the natural world. Having kept a journal since 1931, he swirled his ideas and interest into his career.
Leroy explaining doe. Leroy came in at a transition time when shooting does was a hard sell. There was a great resistance to traditions, and he went to many a meeting and came back with many a weary look. Leroy was very at ease with handling both game and non-game species and was a spokesperson for habitats and niches, weaving them into an exploration and appreciation of the roles occupied in the world. He did this with each sedge, grass, spider, pillows of moss, insects that one might never see, never walk past anything. He set up a path of curiosity for all to follow.
Wildlife in our home? All right. I'm going to start out with our story. All children lose teeth, including yours, Bill. Okay. Ours were honored in a different way. They were placed under our pillow, and we waited for the prairie dog to make a surge, leaving a quarter. Likely he took that tooth. Later we found out that other children were visited by the tooth fairy. The buffet in our dining room wasn't like the buffet in other homes. It was a buffet of natural history of our area. When Dad would come home from field work, he would empty some of his material on top of the buffet. There would be sedges, grasses, vials of spiders and insects ready to be classified. Seasons came and went, with a timely present for our mom from Dad of a flowering willow, witch hazel, or other representation of the phenology of that season. Our home at times was a recovery station for injured animals. Among these, hawks, owls, ducks, geese, songbirds, and the occasional fawn. We learned handling techniques and became acquainted with their exquisite characteristics and habits. When we were the young Lintereur clan, we enjoyed the exploration of Peshtigo Harbor, O'Connell Marsh, wooded areas along M35 and the CARNEY Bog. We have many fond memories of our trips to Canada and the Rocky Mountains, to name a few. We examined the flow of the slides from our trips for years to come. They were replete with snakes, geology like we had never seen, rivers and waterfalls that still form a backdrop in our heads when we discuss anything to do with land formations. Leroy had a deep appreciation for the CARNEY Bog in Michigan, which is a butterfly net.
Happy, really happy.
Everything was noted right down to the calcareous grains of earth that embraced everything below and above them. He continued to find new sedges, classify them, and add them to a bank of information on the CARNEY Fen. We used to call him Sedge Man. Seagull Bar field trip. Leroy gave many field trips to the Seagull Bar natural area. This was a perfect stage for explaining the natural communities of wetlands, marsh, and shoreline. There is now a monument there commemorating this area. It states, and we don't have the monument, but in memoriam and with gratitude to Leroy J. Lintereur, every plant, every creature was given fond and honorable mention and recognition by Leroy J. Lintereur, our retired wildlife manager and avid naturalist. Leroy reminded us we are all epigeans. There is no wall between man and environment. We are one. In that spirit, seek out the natural communities surrounding you, keeping them alive for generations to come. I was going to also get a little bit into the article from New Month magazine. We are all epigeans, but Adrian did such a beautiful, beautiful job. I just wanted to give you a little backdrop for that. It was an article that began it with recognition of a plant called Trailing Arbutus, and its genus name is Epigea, and that is Epi is upon, and then G is the word for earth. So upon earth, and he said, you know, that particular term, when we think in terms of Epigeans, it's easily shared with all of us, and he just really lived that theme. So I'm just going to end with he wrote little things in his books, and we're going to end with that. And thank you very much for giving us the honor to talk about our dad and to listen about our dad as well.
Thank you very much to the speakers talking about Leroy and his wonderful life. We'll now move to the legislative citations. I think it's Katrina's turn to read the one about Leroy.
Well, as always, it's an honor to be here, and I want to thank the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame for bringing us all together each year to honor people who are truly inspiring and who leave behind an incredible legacy for our state and also for our nation. I think Wisconsin has a long history of leading the nation in conservation, and it's people in the room today and the people we get to honor each year who truly are making a mark. So thank you all. So I'm here today to present a citation of commendation from the state of Wisconsin. Know you by these presents. Whereas every year, the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame inducts a select group of individuals into the Hall of Fame to recognize the important contributions each has made to resource management in the state. And whereas Leroy J. Lintereur has been chosen as a 2016 Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame inductee for his lifelong commitment to acquiring, protecting, and enhancing natural resources in northeastern Wisconsin. And whereas Leroy was born on November 22nd, 1920 in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, and whereas Leroy developed an appreciation for the natural world at an early age, keeping an almost daily journal for over 30 years in which he recorded his natural history observations and personal reflections. And whereas Leroy served his country in the Army during World War II, later studying biology and wildlife management at UW-Madison. And whereas Leroy was hired in 1952 by the Wisconsin Conservation Department in Burlington, where he worked as a game manager, explaining complex regulations, program policies, and highly controversial doe shooting proposals to the public, as well as acquiring and managing crucial wildlife habitat. And whereas Leroy was reassigned in Wasaki in 1956 and finally to Marinette in 1958, where he was promoted to area game manager, managing programs and staff in Marinette, Oconto, Shawano, Florence, and Menominee counties until his retirement in 1983. And whereas Leroy was one of 5 members of a committee that drafted the Marinette County Shoreline Zoning Ordinance in 1967, which became a state and nationally recognized conservation hallmark after many court challenges, providing the basis for wetland protection and ultimately preserving tens of thousands of wetland acres in the state. And whereas Leroy wrote a weekly column for the Marinette newspaper from 1968 to 1985, tallying more than 700 articles on the natural history of northeastern Wisconsin, seasoned with ecological themes and personal observations. And whereas Leroy dedicated his life to learning about and caring for the natural world around him, acquiring critical habitat for wildlife and rare plant communities, educating the public about the purpose of habitat and its proper care, promoting protection and preservation of wetlands, and inspiring countless new conservationists over his long career. Now, therefore, Senator Julie Lassa and Representative Katrina Shankland do hereby honor Leroy J. Lintereur for his lifelong commitment to the land and its resources, and his critical role in connecting various conservation interests to preserve Wisconsin's natural landscape.
Thank you, Katrina and Julie, for helping us with these legislative citations. We'll now go to the unveiling of the plaque for Leroy. As noted earlier, the plaques stay with the Hall of Fame in Speakley, but we do have a replica of that the daughters can fight over. Thank you very much for your touching family.
Symmetrical.